Hello Orchid friends, how are you? Welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time watching my video, my channel is all about orchids. From what orchids I have, how I grow them, my thoughts on certain orchid topics, to what orchids in my collection are blooming, etc. So if you want to follow along my orchid hobby adventure, please consider subscribing to my channel and turn on the notification. Today in this video we have a Repot story to talk about. This is a Phalaenopsis orchid. It's a small, not miniature, but a young plant, and it's a species. And I have two of these in my collection, and this is one of them. So in this video we're going to talk about the steps that I took to repot this orchid and why I chose the kind of method that I use for this orchid. This is the flower, right? It's the Coerulea type. It's equestris, so it's a species, and this type has that Coerulea, that light purple or violet color on its lip. Even though this is considered a young plant, it's never really a big one, even when it's fully matured compared to other kind of orchid species. But the reason I'm repotting this one is because some of the roots are growing on top of the media, the moss, and then it's already hitting the edge of the cup and it's growing upwards now. So I'm at a point where I had to decide if I want to simply add another layer of moss on top of these roots to hopefully redirect the growth direction of the roots, or I'll just have to unpot it and then somehow, use a different method to try to train the roots to grow into the media. And I actually chose the latter, right? So that's why we're having this repot video. It's a fairly common practice for orchid nurseries to add a layer of sphagnum moss on top of newly grown roots. So that way they can somehow train the roots to grow down, or at least not growing out of the pot straight up. And in Asia, I think they just simply call it channeling the roots. This orchid has grown one new leaf under my care, and because it was in a 2-inch cup, it was still relatively small, even though it's a mature sized plant. But I didn't like the roots, how they were growing upwards, so I really had to do something. So I decided that I have to give this orchid a repot, especially it's growing roots, so it's in active growth, so I was just gonna go ahead. I like to soak orchids really well before I take them out of the pot, especially for orchids in moss, because moss, when wet, it's much easier to take them off the roots, to clean them off of the roots than when moss is dry and crispy, because you can still pull dry moss away from roots, but occasionally you may damage the roots during the process. So wet moss is actually a lot easier to work with. So after soaking this orchid for about 20 minutes or so, we were ready to, I was ready to take it out of the cup. So I used my thumb and push it up from the very bottom, and it came right off. The flimsy, the filmy cup came right off. So this orchid had pretty decent root system, even though it was very small in a 2-inch cup. They were already roots at the bottom, and it was easy for me to quickly pull away all the sphagnum moss. And you can see that there are still some tiny pieces of moss around the roots area. And there are a couple ways to clean off these tiny pieces. For those of you who have a lot of patience, you can definitely use a tweezer and slowly take away those tiny pieces. But for somebody like me who don't have that kind of patience, I like to just take this orchid under a faucet with strong enough water pressure, or go take it under a shower head and turn on the shower head, so that way it's easy and it would never take more than say 10-15 seconds to quickly rinse off those tiny little pieces. But a couple tips here. Make sure the water is not completely cold. You want to make sure that it's at least somewhat warm, not too hot. But then also, because these tiny little pieces can potentially clog your drain. So you want to make sure wherever you're doing this, for example, if you're doing on top of your sink, make sure there is a sink strainer, so that way some of these little pieces can be caught on the strainer, so that you can simply dump it out after you're done, because otherwise some of these pieces may go down to your drain and potentially clog your pipe. And before we go on to the next step, if you look at the roots right above my middle finger here, these 4 roots were growing on top of the moss, and it's because it was in active growth that I knew that I have to do something, either add more moss on top, or I had to really take it out of the pot and repot it, because otherwise they would just keep growing, and then once they reach the cup, they're just going to continue to grow upwards, and in the future that's going to create bigger problem when I need to repot this orchid. Now that the roots are cleaned, we can now use hydrogen peroxide 3% and alcohol 70% to spray it down, so that way the roots have a opportunity to get disinfected. And for some reason, some of my trainee scribers were asking me about whether how I make hydrogen peroxide 3% or alcohol 50%. Well, you get them from pharmacy. These concentrations of each type is readily available. 50% usually is most popular or most readily available, but 70%, you don't make these at home. You just buy them from stores. And for me, I don't really always start with hydrogen peroxide or alcohol. It just kind of depends on what is closer to me, I guess. But I do keep them in these spray bottle, but then I use the opaque bottle, because there's something about storing hydrogen peroxide in darker container, because I think the sunlight or some kind of bright light would actually deactivate the property of hydrogen peroxide. So that's something, FYI, may not be true, but I've always seen hydrogen peroxide being sold in darker container because of that reason. I read it somewhere. And now, there is a scissor in between, right? So if you want to, like for this orchid, there wasn't really anything to trim off of the roots. But when you're repotting your orchid, and if you have to use a scissor to trim off any parts, whether it's the roots or the leaves, make sure you use hydrogen peroxide, alcohol, or even use the flame to disinfect the cutting tool, because that way you can make sure you're not spreading any disease from one orchid to another when you're doing the cutting. Another thing I want to remind you, and this is almost a common sense, but some people tend to forget about this part, is the name tags. If your orchid has one, you obviously will keep it, and maybe the stake, you want to keep it and reuse it. Whatever that you're going to keep and you reuse, maybe not right away, you should still disinfect. So use the hydrogen peroxide and or alcohol that you just used for the roots, spray them down as well, so that way they're disinfected. Don't forget this step, because you don't really want to carry around potential fungus spores or whatever from before. Now I decided to use moss as the media, and I decided to go with the moss and no drainage hole growing method for this particular orchid. And the key to this fun method, I think I have maybe 5 or 6 orchid grown in this method. The key to this is you want to make sure it's very fluffy around the moss. So that way you can have very equal ratio of moss and air, and just so that, you know, it's not compacted because there's no drainage. So if you have too much water or, you know, too much of anything is never good, right? So make sure that it's fluffy enough that there is enough air in between. This method is pretty fun and easy for me because if I don't want to soak this orchid, I simply give it sometimes 1/8 of a cup of water, sometimes up to 1/4 cup, and it'll be good for another 10 days or so. So it's super convenient for me. And of course, I use an outer cup to block additional sunlight, so that way there's less of a chance for algae to form. But if it's not if it's not something that bothers you a whole lot, the outer cup or the decorative pot is definitely not a requirement. This is all I have for you today. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you would like to get more orchid related videos from my channel, please subscribe and turn on the notification. I want to wish you happy growing, and I will talk to you in my next video. Ciao!